Today, we travel back to foggy streets of 1930s Liverpool, where a mysterious call sent a man to a meeting that never existed, while his wife was murdered at home. Some say it was a cruel twist of fate. Others say it was a perfect crime. But the truth? It slipped through the cracks of justice. So sit back and enter the haunting case of Julia Wallace. For God's sake, come quick, he's killed her. That was what the housekeeper screamed when she saw the body. But this wasn't a scene of sudden fury. No, this was precision, or obsession, or both. Julia Wallace lay slumped in the parlor of 29, Wolverton Street, Liverpool, her skull shattered like a broken teacup. Not one blow, not two. Her head had been caved in with at least 11 crushing strikes, delivered by a weapon that would never be found. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no noise, just the obscene stillness of a corpse and a room arranged with the kind of logic only madness understands. Here's where it gets weird. The murder happened while her husband, William Herbert Wallace, claimed he was across the city, chasing a man who may have never existed, to an address that didn't exist, after receiving a telephone call placed by someone who still, to this day, has never been identified. It's like Agatha Christie got bored of subtlety and went full Lovecraft. A woman dead in her own home, a husband with a perfect alibi, orchestrated by someone playing five-dimensional chess, or just an average insurance clerk with flair for blood and theater. This isn't just a murder mystery. It's an epistemological crisis. Because when you reach the center of this story, you don't find answers. You find mirrors. Liverpool, 1931. A city in economic shock. Still trying to recover from the financial tremors of the Great Depression. The skyline wore soot like a badge. Industry coughed along in the docks. Coal fires, damp streets, and the greasy breath of old factories. A place where the past hadn't died. It had simply gone gray and tired. Picture narrow alleyways choked with fog. Picture brass street lamps casting yellow halos through the mist. Picture homes packed like sardines, everyone knowing everyone, and assuming the worst of them. Suspicion was cheap, gossip cheaper, but murder? That cost you your soul. The Wallaces lived in Anfield, not the stadium, the suburb. A quiet row house neighborhood with small gardens and fewer secrets than you'd think. In 1931, you didn't lock your door because you assumed your neighbor would be home. And if they weren't, well, someone would notice something, right? But this wasn't the London of Jack the Ripper or the decadent Paris of crime novels. This was a polite, middle-class horror show. Manners with a meat hook behind the curtain. And here's the bitter little cherry on top. This was the age of rationality. Science, logic, deduction. Sherlock Holmes had practically been canonized. People believed in order. They believed the truth could be found if you were clever enough to ask the right questions. So when Julia Wallace ended up dead in a blood-smeared room with no clear killer, no murder weapon, and an alibi so perfect it started to stink, the city didn't just panic. It imploded. William Herbert Wallace was not the kind of man you'd expect to find at the center of a gothic nightmare. He was 52, asthmatic, with the dry, bony energy of a man who spent more time with account books than people. He sold insurance door to door, wore his suits too formally even for informal days, and played chess with the obsessive precision of a man who believed life could be won, if only you made all the right moves. He wasn't charming. He wasn't particularly well-liked. But he was respected. In that vague, reluctant way people respect anyone who always shows up and never causes a scene. He'd married Julia later in life. She was older, quieter, an ex-music teacher who spoke with a soft voice and always kept a clean house. They lived in a prim, almost sterile domesticity that felt less like a romance and more like a ceasefire. Some say he adored her. Others say he tolerated her. No one really knows, because Julia didn't leave behind letters or long confessions, and William wasn't the sort to spill his inner life. He was the kind of man who ironed his collar even in grief. But here's what we do know. Wallace wasn't stupid. He belonged to the Liverpool Central Chess Club, a serious, tight-knit group where tactics were theology. Every Tuesday, he'd make his way to the city cafe, sit under the dull glow of gas lamps, and push wooden pieces around a board while thinking 4 moves ahead of everyone in the room. Chess was where he escaped, But it was also where the nightmare began, because it was at that very club, during one of those ordinary Tuesday evenings, that he was handed the key to his wife's murder. A key shaped like a message from a man who did not exist. It started with a phone call, but not to William. The City Cafe, where Wallace played chess every Tuesday, received a strange message on the evening of January 19th, 1931. A man, soft-spoken, untraceable, called the cafe just before 7:30 p.m. He asked for Wallace by name, said it was urgent, gave a message to pass along. Tell Mr. Wallace that Mr. Qualtrough wishes to meet him tomorrow evening at 25, Menlove Gardens East at 7:30, regarding insurance. The club's secretary passed it on. Wallace, looking mildly puzzled, nodded. Menlove Gardens East. He scribbled it down. Here's where it tilts into absurdity. There's a Menlove Avenue in Liverpool, and there's a Menlove Gardens North, South, and West. But Menlove Gardens East doesn't exist. It never existed. No street, no houses, no record. Just a phantom direction scribbled on a scrap of paper by a man who called out of nowhere to reach another man by name in a specific place on a specific night. Wallace, for reasons still argued over by criminal historians and conspiracy theorists alike, went anyway. On the evening of January 20th, he left his house in a stiff, nervous shuffle, said goodbye to Julia, told her he was off to meet a client about insurance, an odd but not impossible thing in his line of work. He took 2 trams, stopping to ask multiple conductors and passers-by about the address. No one could help him. Some said he seemed confused. Others said he seemed performative, like a man pretending to be confused. He searched until just before 8 p.m., then gave up, returned home, and found the front door locked from the inside. When he finally got in, with help from a neighbor and a constable, he walked into the parlor and found Julia on the rug. Her head wasn't a head anymore, and everything unraveled. It didn't make sense. None of it. The deeper police dug, the stranger it got, like trying to piece together a puzzle where the final picture was a scream. Let's start with the crime scene. Julia Wallace had been killed in the sitting room, just a few feet from the fireplace. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. Her handbag was untouched. Jewelry still in place. The killer hadn't come for valuables. They'd come for her. But even the blood was strange. It had pooled and hardened fast, suggesting she'd been dead for over an hour before Wallace found her, which should have overlapped with the time he was riding trams across Liverpool, asking random strangers about a non-existent street. It was either a masterclass in staged innocence or the luckiest alibi in British criminal history. And the timing? Utter chaos. Wallace left the house around 6:45 p.m. Witnesses confirmed this. He was seen on the trams. Multiple people remembered speaking to him. One conductor even joked about how puzzled he looked trying to find the fake address. If he did commit the murder, he had less than 15 minutes to bludgeon his wife to death, clean himself up, and leave, all without leaving a trace of blood on his person, on his clothes, or in the bathroom. Impossible unless he was a magician, or unless someone else did it for him, which is where the theories began to fester. Did Wallace hire a killer? Did he fake the phone call himself, then orchestrate the whole thing as a chess move to remove his wife? Or was the real murderer someone who knew Wallace's schedule, someone who knew he'd be out at that time, leaving Julia alone and unguarded? The telephone call had no record. The number it came from was untraceable, and the voice described only as quiet and respectful, like a ghost making an appointment. This is the part where logic should step in and solve everything. Spoiler, it doesn't. The Liverpool police took one look at Wallace's story and practically tripped over themselves to arrest him. Their reasoning? Too perfect, too weird, too scripted. They didn't buy the phantom caller. They didn't buy the impossible alibi. And most of all, they didn't buy that an aging insurance agent with chronic kidney issues and the lung capacity of a rusted accordion could just happen to be out of the house while his wife was annihilated by an invisible assailant. So they followed the path of least imagination. He did it. They theorized Wallace had placed a phone call himself a night before from a payphone, using a disguised voice. Then, after creating this wild goose chase for himself, he killed Julia before leaving, cleaned up, locked the door from the inside using some mechanical trickery. Don't ask how. They never proved it. And staged his clueless tram adventure to seem innocent. There's just one problem. None of this was ever proven. The police couldn't trace the phone call. They couldn't find blood on Wallace's clothes. There were no fingerprints on the body, no murder weapon, and no convincing evidence of forced timing. The case rested almost entirely on the idea that Wallace was the only person who could have done it. That's it. That's the spine of the prosecution. Logistical faith and vibes. Meanwhile, Wallace had supporters, not many, but loud ones. Raymond Chandler, the noir godfather himself, later called the case the impossible murder. Said Wallace's supposed plot was too complex, too neat, too doomed to failure to be real, and that if Wallace had done it, he was the greatest criminal brain of all time. You don't say that about a guy who sells life insurance and wears his socks 2 inches too high. Even his defense attorney, one Roland Oliver, pointed out how mad the theory sounded. It is not a question of whether the prosecution's theory is improbable, he told the court. It is whether it is physically possible at all. But the jury, they bought it. Hook, line, and contradiction. Wallace was found guilty and sentenced to death. Until the next plot twist detonated. For weeks after the verdict, the ground cracked open. Wallace was on death row, literally counting down the days until execution, when the British Court of Criminal Appeal did something unprecedented. It threw the entire conviction out. Why? Not because of new evidence. Not because someone else confessed. Not because of a last-minute DNA test. This was 1931. They were still amazed by zippers. No. The conviction was overturned because, in their words, the verdict could not be supported by the evidence. That's a polite British way of saying, you can't just convict someone because the vibes are spooky. It was the first time in British legal history that a murder conviction was overturned due to insufficient evidence without a retrial. No do-over. No court sequel. Wallace walked out of prison a free man. Stunned. Pale. Alive. And the public? Lost. Their brains tied in knots. Some thought it was justice. Others thought it was proof that rich, respectable white men could murder their wives and get away with it. The press feasted on the story like it was the last meal before a war. And the police? Embarrassed, doesn't even begin to cover it. They had gambled on a half-built theory, failed to produce a single definitive proof, and ended up shattering one of their own high-profile cases in front of the entire country. The legal collapse sparked a psychological one. If Wallace didn't do it, then who the hell did? Some said it was a disgruntled colleague from the insurance office, a man named Perry who knew about Wallace's chest nights and had coincidentally left town the day after the murder. But nothing stuck. Others believed Julia had been targeted by someone entirely unknown, a burglar, a random killer, maybe even a psychotic neighbor who snapped. But again, no evidence, no motive, no name. There was no smoking gun, only an echo, a woman beaten into silence, a husband convicted and unconvicted, and a question that grew louder the longer no one answered it. Let's be clear, there was no resolution. Not a clean one, not the kind that wraps itself up with a gavel bang and a final monologue. No one was ever convicted of Julia Wallace's murder. No new suspects were arrested. No second trial. The case, after all the legal fire and moral thunder, simply faded like smoke from a fire that shouldn't have gone out. And yet, the questions refused to die. Could William Wallace really have orchestrated it all? Could he have made that phone call in disguise, beaten his wife to death with a mystery weapon, locked the door from the inside using some obscure mechanical trick, left no blood on himself, and then calmly ridden 2 trams across town asking about a street that didn't exist? Some say yes, that he was a cold-blooded intellectual, a chess-playing sociopath who planned the perfect murder and nearly got away with it. Nearly. Others argue the opposite, that Wallace was far too socially awkward, physically weak, and obsessively law-abiding to pull off something so intricate. They point out that Julia's death wasn't just brutal, it was intimate, rage-filled, impulsive, the kind of killing done by someone who hated her in a way Wallace never seemed to. Then there's a theory that refuses to die, Richard Gordon Perry, a flashy, reckless younger man who once worked with Wallace in insurance, a known liar, A known thief, a man who had motive, means, and crucially, access to Wallace's schedule. He knew about the chess club. He knew about Wallace's routine. And witnesses said he was acting strangely in the days after the murder. Nervous, avoidant. His car? Seen being cleaned obsessively. But police couldn't make the case stick. They said it was all hearsay, gossip, unprovable. Perry lived out his life. Died in 1980. Never charged. Never confessed. And so the case remains like a cracked window in a locked room. Impossible to open, but you feel the draft. There's no closure here. Just the echo of a woman's final silence. And the sound of chess pieces being moved in the dark. The murder of Julia Wallace didn't just fracture family. It fractured faith, in justice, in evidence, in the idea that the truth always wins if you're clever enough. William Wallace, after his release, returned to Liverpool like a ghost wearing his own skin. He was hounded, spat on. Neighbors who once nodded politely crossed the street to avoid him. He tried to live quietly. He couldn't. The city had made up its mind. He was either the unluckiest man in Britain or a murderer who beat the system. He died 2 years later of chronic illness. Alone, his lungs had failed, but so had the world around him. And the thing that haunts most people? He never stopped proclaiming his innocence. Not once. Not in jail. Not on his deathbed. Julia, meanwhile, became less a person and more a symbol. The woman's silence at the center of a riddle. No biography. No memoirs. Her life has been rewritten almost entirely through the lens of her death. No known enemies. No known scandals. Just a brutal ending in a quiet parlor. Blood on the rug. Her face caved in with such force that parts of her skull were found meters away. And the case? It's still studied. Still picked apart by legal scholars, amateur sleuths, murder podcast addicts, and forensic students like it's a cursed crossword puzzle. The Wallace case became one of the earliest and most compelling examples of a locked-room mystery in real life. It exposed how the justice system can bend around assumption, how public opinion can become its own executioner, and how absence of evidence of motive or clarity can be the most damning presence of all. The legal system in Britain shifted after Wallace. The rules about appeals, retrials, evidentiary standards, all subtly reshaped in the wake of one botched conviction, like a scar under the skin of law. And the irony? For a case about someone who may have killed his wife with perfect timing and chess-like calculation, the one thing everyone agrees on is that nothing about it was ever truly in control. It's a crime remembered not for what we know, but for what we don't. Here's the part where I'm supposed to pull it all together. Offer some poetic insight. Deliver the final line like a dagger wrapped in ribbon. But this case doesn't give you that. It's a fog that thickens the closer you get. Every time you try to answer the central question, who killed Julia Wallace? The question spits itself back in your face with a slightly different inflection. What if it wasn't who killed her, but what? What if the murder wasn't just a product of hate or premeditation or opportunity, but something older and darker? Something like entropy, chaos dressed in a cardigan. The idea that sometimes, even in a well-ordered city full of tram tickets and insurance ledgers and quiet husbands with matching socks, the universe still rips through the parlor and leaves behind a corpse and a locked door and a question that can't be answered. And maybe the most chilling part is this. It almost worked. If Wallace was innocent, we built a gallows for a man because the story felt too clever. If he was guilty, we let a murderer go because he was just clever enough. Either way, the real monster wasn't just a killer. It was certainty. Certainty that the strange man must be guilty because his alibi was too tidy. Certainty that no one else could have done it because it didn't make sense otherwise. Certainty that the law would sort it all out. When in fact, the law tied itself in knots and hung them around a neck that may or may not have deserved it. In the end, the last piece on the chessboard wasn't a king or a queen. It was a question mark. Still standing. Still undefeated. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.